There's a map that was made just before Christopher Columbus set sail, and on that map, where the Americas should be, there's basically nothing. A few vague notes about some island the Vikings claimed to have found somewhere out west. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody thought it mattered. That's where this story starts. Columbus wasn't trying to find a new world. He was trying to find a shortcut to Asia. The idea was simple. Sail west, reach India, come back rich. What he actually found was a handful of Caribbean islands that had no spices, no silk, and no obvious connection to Asia whatsoever. But he came back with gold. And gold, it turned out, was enough. So when he showed up in front of the King and Queen of Spain, the conversation went something like this. "Great voyage, Columbus. Where are the spices?" "Well, no spices yet. But there's gold. Lots of it. Perfect. Go back. Tell everyone to become Christians and bring more gold." And that was pretty much the blueprint for everything that followed. Spain and Portugal were the two big players at this point, and they weren't interested in sharing. So they literally drew a line down the middle of the map and divided the non-Christian world between them. Portugal got one side, Spain got the other. Portugal sailed east around Africa and built a massive trading empire in Asia. Spain headed west and started conquering everything in sight. Here's the thing about North America in those early years. Nobody wanted it. All the interesting stuff, the gold, the silver, the large civilizations to conquer, was down in Central and South America. That's where Spain focused. They did send an expedition into North America in 1539, but they didn't find gold or silver, so they mostly shrugged and moved on. For over a century, the lands that would eventually become the United States were treated as an inconvenient obstacle between Europe and more valuable places. England was paying attention, though. They sent an explorer to North America, while Spain was still poking around the Caribbean islands. But after that early expedition, the English also lost interest for nearly 100 years. When they finally got serious about colonizing, their first attempt at Roanoke in 1585 ended in one of history's most enduring mysteries. The colony vanished, completely. Nobody has ever fully explained it. Their second attempt was Jamestown. That one stuck. Then came Plymouth. The Pilgrims were deeply religious, strictly so, the kind of people who outlawed gambling and considered celebrating Christmas dangerously frivolous. They weren't exactly the life of the party, but they came, and others followed, and before long the entire eastern coastline was filling up with British settlements. While the British were building colonies along the coast, the French were quietly claiming everything in the middle. And by 1754, all that overlapping ambition was finally going to have to get sorted out. France controlled an enormous stretch of territory, but had only about 60,000 settlers spread across it. The British colonies had over 1 million people. When war broke out, the French and Indian War, named for the alliance France built with various native tribes, the numbers told most of the story. The British won, decisively. The war in America was part of a larger conflict in Europe, and when the whole thing was finally settled, the map got redrawn dramatically. France gave half of Louisiana to Spain before the war ended to keep it out of British hands, then handed the other half of Louisiana to Britain anyway, along with Canada. France essentially walked away from North America almost entirely. Britain now had an enormous amount of land. It also had an enormous amount of debt from paying for the war, and somebody had to cover that. The somebody they had in mind was the colonies. The colonies had a different perspective on this. The way they saw it, they'd been doing most of the actual fighting and dying. They didn't feel like they owed Britain anything, and the idea of being taxed by a government they had no vote in was, to put it gently, not well received. The disagreement escalated. The disagreement became a conflict. The conflict became a revolution. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Americans declared their independence. But declaring independence and actually winning independence are two different things. It took 5 more years of war before Britain accepted the reality, and even after victory the new country had serious problems. The 13 colonies had essentially become 13 separate little countries, held together by almost nothing. The central government was nearly powerless. The whole experiment was on the verge of collapsing before it had really begun. So the founders went back to the drawing board. They wrote a new constitution, built a functioning federal government from scratch, and in 1789 George Washington became the first president of a country that had finally figured out how to actually be a country. The United States at that point was a narrow strip along the eastern coast. Everything to the west and south belonged to Spain. The new nation was functional, but it was small. Then Napoleon happened. France's new ruler had grand ambitions for a North American empire. He made a deal with Spain to get Louisiana back, but there was a problem. The Americans depended on the Mississippi River for trade, and the idea of an aggressive, expansionist Napoleon controlling the mouth of that river made them extremely nervous. America approached France about buying New Orleans. Just New Orleans. That's all they asked for. What they got was a phone call, essentially, from Napoleon saying something like, "I've been thinking, and I've decided to sell you everything." Napoleon had calculated that selling Louisiana to the Americans would both fund his European wars and turn America into a permanent ally against Britain. The Americans agreed so fast they probably didn't believe it was real. $15 million for land that doubled the size of the United States overnight. America's population was growing fast, doubling roughly every 20 years. 7 children per family was normal. All those people needed somewhere to go, and there was an almost incomprehensible amount of land to the west, so they went west. Florida came next, purchased from Spain in 1819. Then Texas. The Mexican government had actually invited American settlers into its northern territories because the land was difficult to control and sparsely populated. The settlers came in such numbers that they eventually outnumbered the Mexicans, declared independence from Mexico, and created their own republic. Then asked to join the United States. This got complicated because Texas had slavery, and the political balance between slave and free states was a constant tension. But in 1845, the US let Texas in. A border dispute led to war with Mexico. When it ended, the US paid Mexico $15 million and took the northern territories. What is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of several other states. A few years later, they bought another piece of Mexican territory for $10 million more. Britain agreed to cede the Oregon Territory below a certain line, and just like that, in about 50 years, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Almost immediately after California became American territory, gold was discovered there. The rush that followed was one of the largest mass migrations in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people from across the country and around the world converged on California with picks and pans and enormous hope. The country was thriving, the territory was vast, the economy was growing. But underneath all of it, a conflict had been building for decades that was going to demand a reckoning. Slavery. In the northern states it was illegal and increasingly viewed as a moral catastrophe that couldn't be allowed to continue. In the southern states it was the foundation of the entire economic system, and any threat to it was treated as an existential attack. The two sides had been managing this tension through compromise after compromise, but the compromises were running out. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the southern states didn't wait to see what he would do. Most of them simply left. They formed their own country and started a war to defend it. 4 years. Enormous casualties on both sides. The bloodiest conflict in American history. The North won. Slavery was abolished. The Union held. It was costly in ways that went beyond the battlefield. Lincoln was assassinated before he could lead the reconstruction he had envisioned. The country spent decades healing, imperfectly, from the wounds of a war that had asked the most fundamental possible question about what America was and what it stood for. In 1867, Russia approached the United States with an interesting offer. Alaska, $7 million. The Secretary of State who negotiated the deal was widely mocked for it. People called it Seward's Folly, a frozen wasteland at the top of the world. What possible use could it be? The purchase went through anyway. Meanwhile, American businessmen had been establishing themselves in Hawaii, and by the early 1890s they had effectively taken control of the islands and were asking Washington to make it official. The sitting president refused, arguing that the United States had no business using its power to take advantage of smaller, weaker nations. His successor had different views, and the argument that won the day was strategic rather than idealistic. If America didn't secure Hawaii, some other major power would, and whoever controlled those islands would have an enormous military advantage in the Pacific. Hawaii was eventually annexed in 1898. The same year, everything in the Caribbean came to a head. Cuba had been fighting for independence from Spain for years. Puerto Rico and the Philippines were still Spanish colonies. Most Americans sympathized with the Cuban revolutionaries, and when an American warship exploded in Havana Harbor, under circumstances that have never been fully explained, public pressure for war became overwhelming. The US told Spain to leave Cuba. Spain declared war instead. It lasted about 4 months. The United States took Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. What remained of the Spanish Empire that Columbus had started building 400 years earlier was effectively finished. Theodore Roosevelt became president after yet another assassination, the third in 35 years, and brought an energy and aggression to the office that reshaped American foreign policy. He wanted a canal across Panama to allow the US Navy to move quickly between oceans. When Colombia, which controlled the territory, backed out of the deal at the last minute, the Americans quietly encouraged Panama to declare independence from Colombia. Panama did. The canal negotiations proceeded. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914, the same year World War I began. In a little over a century, the United States had gone from a narrow strip of struggling colonies on the eastern coast of a continent that Europe had mostly ignored for 100 years to the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, with territory spanning 2 oceans, a navy that could project force globally, and an economy that was already becoming the largest in the world. It hadn't been inevitable. It had been a combination of extraordinary geography, extraordinary luck, extraordinary violence, and a series of decisions by people all over the world. Napoleon, various Spanish and Mexican governments, the Russian Tsar, a handful of Colombian negotiators who changed their minds at the wrong moment. That happened to break in America's favour again and again. The story of how a country gets from nothing to everything in 130 years is rarely as clean as it looks on a map. But the map, at least, shows you where things ended up. And where they ended up by 1914 was everywhere.